This is the podcast channel of the Hungarian Competition Authority, where we discuss current competition law and market trends, our work, cases, and decisions affecting the Hungarian economy and the Hungarian consumers. Stay tuned.
Hello and welcome everyone to the official podcast of the Hungarian Competition Authority. My name is Luca Farkas and the guest of today's episode is Martin Csirszki, who is the head of the decision-making support section of the Competition Authority, working closely with the Competition Council. In today's episode, we will be discussing Martin's new book, titled Agriculture, Sustainability and Competition Law, Policy Paradigms and Their Legal Implications, which was published this year in 2025 by Routledge, one of the world's leading academic publishers. Martin, first of all, thank you for being here and accepting our invitation, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I am really honored to be the first guest of the English language podcast of the Hungarian Competition Authority.
So before we go into any details and findings of your book, what made you interested in exploring the complex relationship between competition, agriculture, and sustainability?
There are several considerations behind this. It really is a niche topic, but there is much more behind this relationship. When I started my research more than 5 years ago, I was really interested in the unfair trading practices in the agricultural and food supply chain, and this was the time when the new EU directive was adopted in this area. And this is not competition law in its traditional and conventional sense. However, this brought with itself my interest in agricultural antitrust exemptions, and later sustainability as a new element in the antitrust regime of agricultural exemptions appeared during the 2021 Common Agricultural Policy Review. And basically this is the substantial part of my consideration. Methodologically, I really like doing research that goes beyond the doctrinal and rigid legal research, and this area cannot be understood without appropriate knowledge about the public policy issues, the different values and interests which are beneath the surface of law. Furthermore, I was really surprised about the limited amount of academic scholarship in this area. And this is not a fancy topic, unlike the problems, for example, arising in digital markets. However, I think that at the end of the day, we do not eat data, but food and agricultural products. And it is a kind of earthbound thinking. But I think this is enough. This consideration is enough to dedicate much more attention to such a neglected area. Basically, this was my first consideration.
Very interesting. And in your book, as the title suggests, you dive into the complex relationship between these fields and provide a detailed law and policy analysis. You do so in light of two paradigms, the neoliberal agricultural policy and the food sovereignty paradigms. How do you define these paradigms, and could you explain how they differ in their approach to competition, agriculture, and sustainability?
To answer this, I have to broaden the context. The feature and the character, the attribute with which I like labeling the relationship between competition, agriculture, and sustainability is the adjective uneasy. There is a contradiction between these public policy areas, in particular competition and agricultural policy. This is what I call the external contradiction. However, there is also an internal contradiction within the respective public policy areas. They are not unified, neither competition policy nor agricultural policy. My aim was to examine the complex relationship between these areas from the viewpoint of agri-policy, in particular from the viewpoint of the different paradigms prevalent in agricultural policy, and these are, which I label as neoliberal and the food sovereignty paradigms. However, it must be emphasized that these are not used in a derogatory tone at all. By neoliberal, I mean a mode of organization of the economy that builds upon the ideal of free market and that lacks state intervention. And basically, neoliberalism treats the agricultural sector the same way as any other industry. The global institutions, such as the World Trade Organization or the World Bank, represent this viewpoint and see the solution of the farm problem in market liberalization. And it is enough to think of, for example, the agreement on agriculture, signed within the World Trade Organization in 1994, and the concurrent obligations that arise from this obligation to cease market-distorting state aids. Of course, also in the European Union as well as in the United States, as some call it in the literature, this was the retrenchment of the agricultural welfare state. On the contrary, as a reaction to it, the food sovereignty paradigm came to the fore in the 1990s. It has several shades of interpretation. I treat it and handle it as a paradigm. However, first and foremost, it is a grassroots movement whose origins and main centers are in the global south, that is African, Asian and South American countries. Food sovereignty proponents support the protection of agricultural producers and advocate for a state whose active role contributes to the protection of producers. They are against transnational companies in the agribusiness sector, and I think, and it is a really important feature, that they recognize the specific attributes of agricultural production and aim to find ways that re-establish our harmonious relationship with nature. A crucial distinction, however, must be made. For many countries in the global south, the real origin of the food sovereignty paradigm and movement, food sovereignty is a question of life or death. The higher the share of agriculture in a country's GDP, the more so. And though there are many attempts, not many, but rather several attempts to interpret food sovereignty in the context of developed countries, such as the analysis in my book, for us it is more related to competitiveness and strategic autonomy. When I started my PhD in 2019, nobody really cared about food sovereignty in an EU context. By 2025, and this was a really good feedback for me, the new vision published in 2025 about the EU agriculture until 2050, it was concluded with the imperative that food sovereignty and strategic autonomy must be one of the most important objectives in EU agricultural policy. So basically, these are the two sides of the coin.
And as you mentioned in the book, you also confront agricultural policy and competition policy. And not surprisingly, you declare agricultural policy as the winner of this clash. How would you summarize this confrontation between the two policies, and what are its consequences for the European Union?
Basically, while competition policy is primarily concerned with the increasing of consumer welfare, in particular with helping end consumers in such aspects as price, quality, choice, innovation, the main goal of agricultural policy is raising the income of agricultural producers, their standard of living, or I could also say its main consideration is producer welfare, so there is a quite great contradiction between the two. Producer welfare versus consumer welfare. These are in most of the time contradictory to one another if we examine their relationship. Just a very easy example. Farmers aim to sell their products at the highest possible price. Consumers, as well as intermediaries in the food supply chain, be they food processors or manufacturers or retailers, wholesalers, they aim to buy the products at the lowest possible price. Mm-hmm. The reason that I declare agricultural policy as the winner of the clash is the high amount of competition law derogations that apply specifically to the agricultural sector, not only in the EU, but also in the US. There are exemptions from the prohibition of anti-competitive agreements. Basically, producers can cooperate and join forces in all kinds of constellation to establish countervailing power against their buyers. However, since abuse of dominance is not too useful for protecting the producers, there are quite a lot other trade regulations, such as the prohibition of a wide variety of unfair trading practices that go really beyond the scope of conventional antitrust abuses. The sector-neutral ideal, the horizontal nature of competition law, which was championed by many and in the competition community, for example, Mastmacher, who is one of the most famous ordoliberal thinker. So the sector-neutral ideal, the horizontal nature of competition law is given up as regards agriculture. The consequences of this in the EU are crystal clear, and I connect this trend with another one. There are more and more agriculture-related derogations in the EU, recently under the aegis of sustainability. However, a comprehensive protective pillar was adopted in 2019 with the Directive on Unfair Trading Practices, and these all derogate competition as seen optimal through the antitrust lens. One of my findings is that the expansion of competition law tools for the better protection of farmers in the EU is a byproduct of the requirement that comes mostly from global level and furthermore because of some internal budgetary constraint that agricultural state aid policies must be made and had to be made less market distorting after the retrenchment of the agricultural welfare state. State aid programs that created enormous surpluses in EU agricultural products, it is enough to think, for example, the so-called butter mountains, meant a soft landing for farmers when agricultural markets were volatile. However, the farmers were supported with direct wealth transfers in the state aids for their production. After decoupling, that is when there is no more money for more quantities produced, this has been stopped. And for me, it seems that the EU decision makers want to give back some protective pillars to producers. The problem is that antitrust and competition tools do not constitute direct wealth transfers for them. The means to achieve the desired end is not appropriate. However, at the level of rhetoric, it is easy to communicate that we help farmers with some great protective pillars in the competitive process. So this is a trend that started in the 1990s, for example, in the Common Agricultural Policy with the McSherry reform, and there were continuous retrenchment in state aids, and this brought with itself another trend, basically increasing the number and amount of other competition tools, but they are not the appropriate tools, I think.
And how would you describe the main takeaway of your book in light of these?
If we take the lens of food sovereignty to analyze competition and trade rules in the countries of the global north, such as the EU and its member states, we can see that the demands of food sovereignty proponents are not well established in a legal sense. The EU protects its producers in the competitive process to a significant extent. Nevertheless, it is also true, and this is also established in the book, that the specifically European competition school of thought, or the liberal competition policy, can still be altered to even better protect the European farmers. I show that there are great similarities between their ideas about the organization of markets. For example, a strong state in this regard is certainly one. Some classical ordoliberals between the two world wars, who, I must confess, cannot be treated at all as the most famous ordoliberals, such as Wilhelm Röpke or Konstantin von Dietze, argued for the necessity of indirect state intervention in agricultural markets. According to them, it is the obligation of the state to supervise agricultural markets. But it is crucial to emphasize that the reality and the policy rhetoric are to be separated in our case, because both the EU and in a more limited manner, the United States too provide a helping hand for its producers in market competition and trade. Food sovereignty ideas, nevertheless, are easier to get embedded in the legal system of the EU. That is what I do in the end of the book. But I must still reiterate that I do it from a perspective of agricultural policy. If we want to help better agricultural producers with competition means, we could place a much greater emphasis, for example, on buyer power issues, both in abuse of dominance and in merger control cases. I must confess that this would be a significant rupture with current general case law in abuse of dominance, for example. However, the first prerequisite would be to lower the dominance threshold, and beyond this introduce a relative threshold in the form of the so-called threat point that would concentrate on the number of products supplied by the producer to one of the powerful buyers. Because basically there are research results that show that if a farmer sells at least 22% or more of its products to one and the same buyer, it is almost impossible for the farmer to lose that bargain. And this dependence on accepting the take it or leave it offers of the buyer results in increased vulnerability. Worries about the increase in buyer power should also play a key role in merger control. Regarding mergers, I can recommend a very insightful analysis to the listeners who are interested that breaks with traditional merger control analysis. It was written by Ioannis Lianos, Stavros Makis and their co-authors about the Banch-Viterra merger.
Thank you. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the recommendation. And you mentioned Europe and the United States, and in the book you also highlight the historical differences between Europe and the US when it comes to the attitudes towards agriculture. What are these historical differences and what impact do you think they have on the current agricultural and competition policies of these actors?
It is a crucial prerequisite that I worked mainly with the system of the European Union, that the faith in well-functioning markets is much higher in the United States than it is in the European Union. Furthermore, since the very beginning, US farms are much bigger than European ones. They produce, I would say, more efficiently. And the average farm size is also significantly greater in the US. Thus, the derogations provided for farmers in US antitrust are based on solid economic evidence. They provide exemptions to farmers because of the theory of countervailing power, that is to countervail the power of agri-food buyers. Even beyond antitrust, such as the Packers and Stockyards Act, which was a reaction to the significantly concentrated meatpacking industry in the US, helping antitrust in its endeavors to create a level playing field, this economics-centered approach appears in the US, even in trade regulation laws, not only in antitrust. In the EU, this is complemented and much more place is given to agricultural policy objectives, also to post-exceptionalist agricultural policy objectives such as sustainability. If we take a look at US antitrust trends, we can see that they have a totally different approach also in general as regards sustainability. One example, they even the quite, I would say, radical neo-Brandeisian approach in US antitrust takes the approach that even if we help the competitive process in itself and we do not concentrate on such issues as sustainability, even with this general attitude without specific considerations for broader values such as sustainability, the competitive markets will bring about those outcomes that we need, for example, in sustainability. So they have very large faith in well-functioning markets, and in the US, this is the main focal point. However, in the European Union, it is enough to take a look at Article 210A of the Common Market Organization Regulation and its recently proposed amendment that brings even social sustainability objectives and considerations into the assessment. If producers between each other or producers and other food supply chain actors collude to achieve certain social sustainability standards, they can be exempted from the prohibition of anti-competitive agreements. I must be honest, great difficulties arise when I try to interpret the freshly proposed regulations about social sustainability standards. According to the plan, for example, the sustainability standard at the core of the agreement that is under assessment can relate also to supporting the economic viability of small farms predominantly relying on family labor, or attracting and supporting young producers of agricultural products. My question would be that how can a competition agency assess these criteria, these non-conventional competition criteria? I don't really know the answer to this one.
You are also citing some staggering statistics in the book, such as that the number of farms globally will be halved, with the average farm size doubling by the end of the century, which could also, of course, change the impact that these will have on the market and on competition. So how do you see these changes from a competition law perspective?
This is a scenario that corresponds with the neoliberal desires, which is basically less farm holdings that produce much more quantities. In an economic sense, a more efficient agricultural sector. From the standpoint of competition law, we must distinguish between two levels. In horizontal competition, that is competition between agricultural producers, I do not anticipate any difference in comparison with the current situation, because the market of agricultural production in any subsectors, I think, will never be so concentrated that it would raise true competition concerns in a conventional antitrust sense. However, against the buyers of agricultural products in vertical relations, these bigger farms may even be better off having greater bargaining power when they sell their products. This is why I say that the objectives of agricultural policy and those of competition policy are not in accordance with one another. Exceptionalist and post-exceptionalist agricultural policies see these market trends as harmful because of their potential societal and environmental implications. Just a few. Small and medium-sized farm enterprises contribute better to biodiversity. They create workplace in rural areas and so on. An efficiency-centered competition law and policy necessarily takes the viewpoint that more efficient farms deliver more efficient market outcomes for consumers. And this future prognosis shows also the great contradiction between these two public policy areas.
At the end of the book, you suggest that, and I quote, stakeholders should turn their attention to other public policy areas to cure the problems of agriculture, end of quote. So what are some of these other public policy areas, and how could they offer a solution to such a complex problem?
One thing is certain for me. Competition and antitrust rules won't solve the problem of the agricultural sector completely. They are great ancillary tools to handle certain market failures in a broad sense. However, the transformation of the agricultural sector is unavoidable. Sustainable agricultural practices must be found. There must be some innovation. Nevertheless, these face great obstacles in the sector. If we concentrate on the EU and analyze the new agricultural vision, I see great and huge contradictions, which have to be eliminated. It is clear that the European Union is committed to an eco-modernist agenda when it comes to the sustainable transformation of the agricultural sector. I would say eco-modernism means that they see the solution in innovation. With innovation, we will deliver better environmental outcomes. Nevertheless, beyond farm incomes, sustainability, competitiveness, and the preservation of the current farm structure that includes small and mostly small and medium-sized farm holdings are also important aims communicated publicly in the European Union. I think achieving in parallel a sustainable and globally competitive agricultural sector cannot necessarily take the burden of a farm structure dominated by small and medium-sized holdings. This has, first and foremost, economic causes such as lack of financial resources, and it even has sociological causes such as attitudinal and cultural aversion, as well as the use of established farming practices. It may encourage policymakers to opt for a transformation of the agricultural sector to one attribute that is overshadowed by large-scale agriculture. If the farm structure is to be preserved, and we aim to develop these holdings technologically, for the sake of sustainability and/or competitiveness, the same constraints emerge. A sustainability-centered farm structure can exist with a great number of small and medium-sized holdings. However, this will not be competitive globally. Overall, the complexity of the consequences of our choices is huge. Competition law is a small piece of cake in this regard. We must find trade-offs between the competing objectives in the common agricultural policy, but it would be idealistic to think that all will be achieved in parallel because of their great complexity and their interdependence. Basically, I think that the EU should choose two of the three, and these three are competitiveness, sustainability, and the small and medium-sized enterprises in agricultural sector. All three cannot remain. If we want to achieve and preserve all three, maybe it will be a failure, or it would be not too realistic to think that we can conserve this situation that is today.
And finally, who would you recommend this book to? And are there any final thoughts that you would like to share with our audience?
However niche the topic may seem, the audience can be wide. Several groups and communities may find some useful information that can be used in their respective areas. Not only lawyers, but also policymakers in competition, agricultural, as well as environmental policy. My main message would be rather a wish. More efforts should be dedicated by researchers in social sciences as well as in legal academia to understand the agricultural sector. I have been working with related topics for about 7 years and I still feel that I'm scratching the surface. I really hope that soon we will experience a renaissance in exploring the complexity of agriculture, agricultural production, agricultural producers from a social science and legal perspective. Recently, I have broadened my perspective with reading philosophy, sociology, political economy, anthropology, development studies, peasant studies, political science, and so on. But I would like to see more. Basically, physiological needs such as food are at the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need to know more about the related questions. Who produces our food and how? What challenges do they face? How has our food system been transformed recently? What does the future hold? And when I hear ideas such as artificial meat, I'm close to crying. Let's give artificiality to intelligence and for intelligence. I want to eat real and nutritious food that was produced by farmers who do not have to fight for their subsistence. Have a harmonious relationship with Mother Nature and experience that they are appreciated. And this should be achieved all over the world for the well-being of every human being, irrespective of their geographical location. This is a kind of romantic agrarianism in our messy world.
What a beautiful wish, though. As we can see, there is a lot to explore. So, Martin, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for being here today and sharing your expertise with our audience. And to our listeners, we encourage you to explore Martin's new book published by Routledge. And thank you for joining us today. We look forward to welcoming you back in our next episode.
Thank you very much for the possibility.
You were listening to a podcast from the Hungarian Competition Authority. If you have enjoyed the conversation, subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with the latest news.